was mentioned by a man named Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher, somebody that Hitler admired a lot. So I hate to be quoting him, but at the same time, I think that the aphorism that he sort of coined here is probably a good one. It certainly could have been said for settlers who came here, and the hard work that they had to do, certainly if it didn't kill them, made them stronger and more muscular, shall we say, and more able to cope. That's not exactly what this is going to be about, though. So I'll continue on from here. When people started to come to this new world, North America, they came to explore, they came to do fur trading, they came as missionaries, and then eventually they came as settlers. But one thing that they all had in common was that they all brought diseases. So here we were with a group of Indigenous people living here who'd never been exposed to any of this stuff and had absolutely no tolerance for it, had absolutely no way of fighting it, had no antibodies. So when all of those diseases on the right-hand side started to appear in their world, there was absolutely nothing they could do at that time. And so, in fact, you'll find, if you read through history of the time, 1600s, late 1500s, you'll find that, in fact, whole populations of Indigenous people were wiped out settlement by settlement by these diseases that were brought. Smallpox being one of the critical ones, we were still, I don't know how many of you were still being inoculated for smallpox when we were little. And even though the last case died out in 1962, in actual fact, I was inoculated before 1962, and I'm sure many of you were as well. It was smallpox that particularly reduced so many native populations or Indigenous populations. And as you can see here, there were epidemics that broke out here, there, and everywhere. Even in Windsor, Ontario, much later, still 67 people caught it, 32 of them died. I mean, it was one of those diseases that when it hit somewhere, it absolutely just wiped out anybody that whose body was in any way too frail to handle it.
How did they know it was just Windsor? Because it's a relatively small country at that time.
It was a small country, but in actual fact, as you'll see when we go along, sometimes groups of people who understood public health and disease could actually contain an outbreak of something and keep it contained. And because Windsor is at a far extreme, sort of at the far western end of Ontario, in actual fact, it managed to be contained there. And so of the 67 people that did manage to end up with it, almost half of them died. So, but it didn't move its way along. Malaria was a funny one for me. I often used to see the word ague in historical books and documents, and I never was actually sure what ague was. Jane Austen refers to ague at one point, but it is actually malaria. I was a little bit surprised that we had so much malaria in Ontario, but once again, it was in southwestern Ontario, in the Lake St. Clair area, down again, the Windsor area, and over on the Rideau as well. And Susanna Moodie mentions the people that she met in one of her books, all shaking with what she called ague, which is, of course, malaria. So in fact, there were some pretty oddball treatments. Bloodletting, which was a classic. Whenever anybody was really ill, they thought if you could just get rid of all the bad blood in them by letting it out of their arm, you just made an incision, hold it over a basin, squeeze hard, let all the blood out, and then, the person would be fine. They would get better. Well, in actual fact, not usually. Quite often, that's what killed them. Sassafras tea was certainly not going to help. It would be lovely, but not helpful. A magic charm, you could hang a charm on a tree and put knots in it for all the numbers of times that you thought you might end up with malaria. And then, in fact, hopefully you wouldn't end up with it any more times than that. I'm not sure whether that's a good idea. And then finally, there were just a few who actually knew how quinine was actually synthesized or where you could obtain it from the cinchona tree out of Peru. And interestingly enough, people in Ontario could get that if they had enough money, although it wasn't synthesized until 1944, so certainly not in Susanna Moodie's time. Typhoid fever was brought to Canada by the poor people who were fleeing, the Irish famine, the potato famine in Ireland. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people came to Canada on ships contaminated with typhoid fever. Typhoid fever came from water that had been, in fact, contaminated in some way with the disease. And so, in fact, you can see the numbers here out of 10,000 people, and then out of 100,000 people, the numbers of people who died before they ever got to where they had hoped to be. Thing. And when you look at that sort of painting drawing, you can see the close proximity of the people. They would have been in steerage, which would be in the bottom of the ship. The water would be absolutely contaminated, no question about it. And they would probably not have much in the way to eat, depending upon the kind of storms they ran into. How long they were in the bottom of the ship could only be imagined and guessed at. And so the numbers were just phenomenal. When they actually got here in 1847, we didn't have much in the way of protections for anybody. We didn't have quarantine here. Quebec City did. Quebec City was the first place to have all kinds of regulations about disease and about quarantine and so on. Not Montreal. Interestingly enough, just down the road, they did nothing. But Quebec City put in place a whole raft of public health regulations and managed to, I think, stay much more healthy than would the people in Montreal and subsequent places. But in fact, they did try to do a few things in Toronto. This is between 47 and 75, and cleaning up just horrible cesspools and things. I mean, I don't even want to talk about where human waste was going at the time, but it certainly wasn't going into a treatment plant. And it wasn't being treated. It was being buried, or it was out on the ice, or it was stuffed down the sewer. I mean, it just wasn't anything that you could possibly cope with in terms of trying to engender some kind of public health. The idea of it being out on the ice so that the ice would melt and it would go into the lake and out of sight, out of mind is sort of frightening. It's also frightening to think that they actually put the water intake very close to the sewage output in Lake Ontario, like not far apart.
Called recycling.
Yeah, is that what that's called? Well, that could be.
Where is Peter Street?
You know where the baseball stadium is in Toronto? Peter Street runs what, along the side of it? Am I right? Yeah, just along the side of it, I think. Yeah, and right down to the lake. Yeah. So, yeah. Right in the heart of Toronto, anyway. It does always take a crisis to motivate a change. We know that. We've seen it in so many different ways. And so, in fact, when people started to get sick more and more often and in greater numbers, then you started to have a movement towards public health and public health works. So in fact, you can see that there was instead of a private waterworks, there was going to be a public waterworks. The wooden pipes, which nobody had bothered to replace when it was owned by the private hands, were replaced by steel when it became public. So these are all the water pipes and so on throughout the city. Public health acts, legislation demanding that that you register deaths before you bury the people, and that you bury them in a cemetery as opposed to the backyard, and so on. There were so many things that had to be done, and so many people who had to be appointed to actually oversee and to watch this stuff and make sure that what was being said was being done. And that was a real trick. However, there were, by this time, by 1884, there were local boards of health. Thank goodness. Life expectancy in Canada, as a result of a number of things, improved and continued to improve. But if you were living in 1851 in Canada, you had a very short life expectancy. And we're not talking about Indigenous people here, because that's another and much worse story. So in fact, I'm simply talking right here about life expectancy among mainly these would be immigrant people coming from Great Britain and so on, France. You can see that there were very high mortality rates when you start looking at historic documents, poor sanitation, no immunization for so many people, and there were constantly disease epidemics sweeping through the country. And so as a result, you can see that until we got past 1900, we didn't even live to the age of 50, which is just kind of crazy when you think about it. One of the things that helped, I think, with public health was registering the cause of death, because you can't do anything about something unless you know what it is you're trying to address. And so when you had to register and have a death certificate, you actually had to say how the person had died, what they had died of. And because you were starting to gather statistics with these death certificates, you could start to look at something and say, whoa, that's not just one case of diphtheria or one or two cases of diphtheria. Now we're into like 6 cases. Now we're into 20 and so on. And then you could start to do something about it. But you have to have the numbers and the proof, especially for government. There were problems, though, with death registration. You had to declare how the person had died. Well, first of all, stillbirths were often ignored because some of the stillbirths were also unwed mothers. And so, in fact, if that became a matter of familial reputation, sometimes people didn't want to report the birth of a child, stillbirth of a child, and anyone would find out that, in fact, the daughter had been pregnant. Communicable diseases, if you reported that your child had cholera, maybe the other children wouldn't be able to go to school. Now you've got a family of 6, 5 who should be going to school, 1 with cholera. Now they're all at home. They're all going to get it, and so on. Mind you, if they go to school, everybody else is going to get it. So all very, very iffy. Deaths from a lot of different diseases were thought to be associated with poverty, with unclean living conditions. And that really wasn't always the case. But that's what people whose noses were slightly more elevated than other noses might like to attribute that disease to. When in actual fact, many of the death registrations bear the names of very well-to-do families. That's looking at deaths here in Gravenhurst, for example, and in the townships surrounding us. And you learn really quickly that death from any disease could come to anyone at any time, and it had nothing to do with your class or with your income or how clean your house was or anything else. And to complicate registration even further, Catholic deaths for quite a long time were not registered civilly. They were registered with the church. So you didn't get an accurate picture.
When did that change?
Yeah, it changed just after the turn of the century, to some degree. There were priests who, I think, wanted to maintain the old ways. And so, in fact, I'm not going to say it was universally remedied, but it was on the way to that following the turn of the century. When you look at having to register a death, there was a lot involved in it. Sometimes when you look at the death registers and you look at records of children dying and so on, the father would have to come from whatever farm or little village or whatever they were living in and take that information to a central location. So for instance, around here, it would be Bracebridge. Well, in the middle of coping with illness in the family and grief and everything else, somebody who's going to have to hitch up the horses, get out the wagon and so on, or the sleigh, and then try to get 10 miles away in bad weather, whatever, it's not going to happen easily for sure. So sometimes whole batches of deaths were registered at one time, in the same way whole batches of births. You might want to notice that those elderly 60-year-olds, yeah, those ones, always the ages were a bit sketchy because we didn't really have birth certificates for a very long time. So people thought they knew when they were born, but they didn't always know when they were born. And so when you're looking at registrations, for example, for soldiers in the First World War, many of them had no idea when they were born and were guessing. Mom would say, well, we had 12 children, and I think you were fifth. So you would have been after him, but before her. So it could have been around, and that was as close as it got. So in actual fact, you didn't always have really, really accurate records. You often didn't have a doctor who could attend, especially in the wintertime. And so in fact, there were guesses being made as to causes of death. And you can imagine there'll be a few that you'll be surprised at. If it wasn't easy to live during Victorian times, it wasn't easy to report deaths either. That's just an example from Morrison Township, which is of course now a part of Ravenhurst. And in 1875, those are the people who died in Morrison Township. And you will notice the ratio of adult to baby or child is phenomenally high for children's death. And the sheer number of diphtheria deaths, sometimes called inflammation, or sometimes called something else because the doctor really didn't know what he was dealing with if he'd not run into diphtheria before. In actual fact, diphtheria was rampant in 1875. The death registrations in 1880 started to improve a little bit, although diphtheria deaths were down a little bit maybe, but the scarlet fever deaths started to appear. And that's something they hadn't really had to deal with before. But I particularly wanted to draw your attention to the cause of death as teething. Teething. Now, picture that, hold that in your mind, because later on that's going to become interesting. So in actual fact, you're looking at some pretty standard types of causes of death there. Scarlet fever and diphtheria being very, very common. Congestion of the brain. I'm not sure what that means. Too many ideas, perhaps. And therefore, the brain just got too crowded. And I have no idea what congestion of the brain would be. But anyway, you're looking at a disproportionate number of children dying in all of these 1880 registrations. And hang on to teething. There was an epidemic of smallpox that happened in Eastern Ontario. It was actually sort of between Rockville and Cornwall and up towards the Ottawa River. They managed to hold that smallpox invasion in the township where it occurred, and it didn't get out. Now, to my mind, in 1884, that was virtually a miracle. I mean, they did all the right things because somebody there knew what to do. They knew you had to close the schools and the churches. They knew you couldn't have any travel going on. They had constables on all the little, even the little back roads saying, nope, sorry, turn around, go back. They had medical students that they brought in from a couple of the universities to do house-to-house vaccinations, and they fumigated the houses. So although 45 people died from smallpox out of the 202 cases, not a bad ratio for smallpox, which is an extremely deadly disease. So I think that those people, somehow they had someone who knew what to do. It was not true in many other places. And these are signs actually from the archives of scares. These used to be posted on houses on the outside of the house. So if there was scarlet fever, there it was, plastered on the outside of the house. Diphtheria, smallpox, keep out of this house. In some cases, you actually had to pay the medical officer of health to come and take the sign off the house. Imagine that as an effrontery after you've lost maybe 3 children in the course of having scarlet fever or smallpox, whatever. Now you're going to pay the medical officer of health to come and take down the sign, right? I mean, yeah. However,
we had this in England in 1938.
Yep. Yep.
Put it on the front window of your house.
Absolutely. It had to be right on the front of the house, had to be near enough to the front door that anybody who was attempting to go in would see the sign and not attempt to do it. schools were and continue to be the hothouses of disease. I think anybody who's ever been a teacher, as have several of us in this room, know that all that you had to do was sort of be in a room with, some heat in the room and a little bit of moisture and humidity and so on. Before you knew it, the one person coughing became the 5 people coughing, became the 10. And by the end of the week, the entire room was just full of a cold. In actual fact, it could be worse though, because it could be smallpox. And having a water pail and a common cup was just perfect for spreading disease. And that was what happened in most schools. You had a pail in each room of water. One child was assigned to fill the pail in the morning. You had a dipper and you had a cup. And so in fact, you filled the cup for each kid, and each kid drank from it without it being washed, and therefore germs. By 1886, a commonly cited cause was inflammation. Only you could tell it was a doctor who had no idea why the person had died. And so they called it inflammation. They didn't say what was inflamed. It was just inflammation that got them. Or summer complaint, which was diarrhea. You can imagine, well, the story from my past. As a little girl, without my parents' permission, I went with a family across the street and we went swimming in Bender's Creek. Bender's Creek was filled with cattle from time to time. They went down to Bender's Creek to drink. That's what the cattle did. And while they were drinking, they often did more than that. And then you went and swam in it. And in actual fact, summer complaint came from exactly that. You were swimming in contaminated water, contaminated by manure of cattle. So you can only imagine how easily that would happen, because in the summertime, kids all want to get to the water. It'd be creeks and rivers and lakes and so on. And depending on the size and the number of cattle infesting the lake or water, you would have manure everywhere. And of course, automatically almost, if the doctor didn't know what to call it, if you were over 60, you died of old age. It was as simple as that. Well, you just lived too long, obviously. I mean, when you looked at the death or at the life expectancy, you saw that you weren't really supposed to be living that long. You were supposed to be 45 and die. So if you lived to 60, you lived too long. You lived too long. By 1892, fewer children were dying, but some new, what should we call them, causes had arisen. Cholera infantum being one of them, and that one seemed to be used quite often. You can also see influenza, which was also called la grippe. And interestingly enough, a number of doctors actually called it that, even in this very non-French speaking area. A number of doctors called it la grippe. And you also had tuberculosis, which was also known as consumption or phthisis. These were diseases that were on the rise. And in fact, a summer of death shows that of 33 people who died in 1892, half of them were children. In 1896, statistics show a marked rise in consumption or tuberculosis. And as well, cholera infantum is still hanging on, but there's teething again as a cause of death, along with diphtheria, typhoid fever, and so on. The ratio of children to adults dying is improving, but the number of people dying of TB is rising. And of course, then you've also got the fickle finger of fate, which is murder, coming in there, and a husband killing his wife with poison. There were consequences to the deaths of so many children. For one thing, you wiped out a whole generation. You were just wiping out a generation, number by number by number. Along with that, you had things happening like the twin sons of William Meinardus, who died within hours of each other. And the father just couldn't deal with it. And weeks later, he committed suicide. He was a merchant on our main street. So when he did that, it was such big news that it was actually in the Toronto Star, it was and so on, because he was a fairly well-known and successful merchant. But he couldn't live with the death of his twin sons, for whom he probably had all kinds of plans. I've tried to show the deaths of 1899 and 1900 to compare them in black and red. So although consumption is down a little bit, or TB is down a little bit, it really isn't. That was a fluke. In actual fact, though, look at pneumonia on the rise, and look as well at meningitis, which is pretty serious stuff, and cholera infantum, which has gone from 5 to 20 in 1 year. So, you know, it wasn't surprising to have a number, and quite a high number, of accidental deaths. A lot of people died by drowning because children weren't taught to swim. There weren't swimming lessons. And so, in fact, children got carried away in currents and so on. And before you knew it, you had all kinds of children dying and trying to save each other and dying in the process. And you also had logging and lumbering, which were taking the toll of young men and middle-aged men. So there are rational explanations for some of the statistics that you look at here. In 1899, Gravenhurst enacted a bylaw which would deal with who could have infected people in their homes and in their lodgings. It came about as a result of the fact that, first of all, the cottage sanatorium for tuberculosis, the first sanatorium for the treatment of tuberculosis to be built in Canada, was built here in Gravenhurst, 1897. Now you've got rafts of people coming from across Canada hoping to get into that cottage sanatorium. Well, it could only take about 30 people to start with, and you probably had 100 people lined up at the door. Now, where are they going to go? They've taken a train, they've come from heaven knows where, and immediately you've now got boarding houses and lodging houses, and you've got all kinds of places, hotels, and these people are knocking on the door saying, I have nowhere to go. I can't get into the sanatorium, and I have tuberculosis. Huge, huge issue. Charles Mickle attempted to deal with it by enacting this bylaw, which would basically spell out for people with lodging and boarding accommodation what they couldn't do and how it had to happen. Gage not only, Sir William Gage, not only had these sanatoriums being built, the first one 1897, but he also got people to build 2 homes that looked like that. They look identical on Lake Muskoka for, I'm going to say, recovering TB patients. I'm not always sure that was true. I think sometimes they were people who were in the early or incipient stages of tuberculosis in those houses. But it was a big issue. So we've got all of these diseases that we're talking about, and they're taking the toll on all kinds of people. And we've got patent medicines that say we can cure anything. Just let us at it. And so in actual fact, you've got a little story that was told. 4 flies, good friends, were flying into a community like Gravenhurst. And they were flying one behind the other, and it was, you know, sort of maybe an hour between each fly coming, but they were good friends. And the first one flew into a house, and he said, wow, it's a bowl of sugar. He dove into the bowl of sugar. And before you knew it, he was flat on his back on the table, and he was dead, legs in the air. The second one flew in, and he found sitting on the table a bottle of syrup. Some of it had spilled down the side from the pancakes eaten that morning. And so that fly was really excited. And he got right onto the table and he got right into the syrup that had been spilled. And he was lapping it up when, lo and behold, flipped over on his back. He was dead, legs in the air. The third one came in, looked around and said, whoa, yikes, I'll go into the flour. That doesn't look like it's too seriously bad for me. Leaped into the flour and thought, I'll just wait here till somebody makes cookies. And lo and behold, he was dead as a doornail, legs in the air. The fourth one, having looked at these 3 buddies of his and said, wow, they've all committed suicide. This isn't good. I'm just going to commit suicide with them. I want to be with my friends. So he went and he leapt into a dish full of poison that had been put out to kill flies and bugs. It was so adulterated that he lived happily ever after. And there was absolutely nothing wrong with him whatsoever. This is called adulteration of foods and other things. People made their own bread up till about the 1840s, but as soon as you got cities being formed and people working in industry from 7 in the morning till 7 at night at best, 6.5 days a week, in actual fact, baking bread became a thing of the past in cities. And so companies were making it. And of course, companies are all about profit. So they would like to maximize the whiteness of a loaf of bread and the weight of a loaf of bread. So they would add a few things to the concoction that was making the bread. Plaster of Paris, bean flour, chalk, alum, rice, potatoes, sulfate of copper, bone ashes, bone dust, white clay, carbonate of soda, magnesia, lime, mineral white, terra alba, hydrated sulfate of lime, and need I go on. All to make the bread weigh more because it was sold by weight, and whiter because we all wanted white bread, right? Even now our children probably want white bread and not whole wheat. I do. Milk and cream were also adulterated. So chalk and boracic acid was added to milk to enhance its whiteness. Flour and arrowroot made cream thicker. Copper made butter a little bit more yellowy golden. And then, of course, there was ice cream. And when you look at that list of things to be found in ice cream, as they were when it was tested, you can only cry, except that I went to university with a friend who in the summertime worked in a creamery where ice cream on a fairly large scale. I'm not going to name the company in case I frighten you. But anyway, it was in Southwestern Ontario. She worked at this company. And she said they didn't clean out the big vats for making ice cream. They just let the rats and the mice go in and do that during the night. And then the next day they'd start over again. So when you see bed bugs, fleas, straw, and rat feces, you're not surprised. Even candy was adulterated. And it was so commonly done that there were actually pictures like that showing the lozenge maker who was adding plaster of Paris, arsenic, and whatnot to bonbons. Hard candy was the classic. Actually, it was usually added to add color to hard candy. Now, the gentleman here and possibly some of the ladies are crying, not my beer, surely not my rum, my wine. All of these things were adulterated along with chocolate and other things with mercury, lead, copperas, which I had to look up, and so on. And the result of all that adulteration, the lack of sanitation, was more profit. And that's what companies were all about and continue to be all about. And that contributed to typhoid fever because water being added to milk, for example, the water, if it was not from a pure source, but rather had been contaminated, was added to the milk. And then the result would be diarrhea, dysentery, and possibly death. But remember, of course, that there were patent medicines to take care of all of this. There was a cure for everything, right? So, I mean, if you got sick, there's a cure. Well, a lot of medicines were downright dangerous. They took you away from a doctor by simply saying it in advertisements in the newspaper, we can cure whatever it is you've got. They tended to be full of alcohol if they were liquid. Therefore, they were addictive. And in 1876 samples that were analyzed, there was so much alcohol in some of the tonics that you could have actually sold them as spirits in a liquor store and said, you know, this is practically pure alcohol. And even the grocery items in 1883 were tested to discover that they'd been adulterated with everything from soup to nuts, 63% of them. And there you go, teething. If your child is teething, give them cocaine,
Wow.
tooth drops, right? And that's going to really,
Instant cure.
yeah, instant unconsciousness possibly. There was Dr. Ingham's nervine pain extractor, which is a little frightening for me, just the sound of it. But, you know, if you had worms, croup, cholera no less, you could in fact take Dr. Ingham's extractor, which was full of alcohol, morphine, camphor, and capsicum, and in fact, you would be cured. People who read novels from the Victorian age will think about women who took laudanum. It was something that you could take for your nerves, or because you were anxious or whatever. Well, no wonder. It was full of opium and alcohol, and it was so addictive that it was absolutely ridiculous. But in fact, the taste of it was sort of whittled down with honey, spice, wine, whiskey, brandy, hashish, no less. And depending upon the strength of it, you know, you had some addicted people pretty quickly. For that annoying cough or tickle in your throat, take a few drops of Kimball's cough syrup, which contained chloroform and alcohol. So in actual fact, you know, you'd be knocked unconscious, but you wouldn't be coughing, right? So there you go. Depends on what you want. I had a doctor once ask me when I broke out into all kinds of great big lumps from a medicine he had prescribed. He said, "What do you prefer, the migraines or the lumps?" Didn't seem like some kind of a choice to me, but anyway, pink pills for pale people. I think pink pills for pale people ought to be a favorite tongue twister for all of us, because in actual fact, it's Canadian. That was a Canadian quack cure-all sold across the world. And they were very, very popular for quite a while. And in actual fact, look at the ingredients in there. A little bit of licorice would sort of put me off. I don't like licorice, but sugar and iron, potassium, magnesium, but no medication whatsoever. I love this. I'm asthmatic. I'm asthmatic. I tried to smoke for years, well, 2 years, when I was in high school. It was the cool thing to do, you know, and I was asthmatic from the time I was 8. That's when I was diagnosed. So here I am trying to smoke not regular cigarettes, but menthol, because I'm figuring Rothman's menthol cigarettes are going to be better for an asthmatic to smoke, right, than just your plain. And actual fact, if you smoke asthma cigarettes, you're going to cure your asthma and your hay fever. Asthma cigarettes, imagine. I never did get through more than about 3 puffs on a cigarette before I was in such a paroxysm of coughing that in actual fact, I had to stop. And my friend who was trying to teach me to smoke, I would waste more of his cigarettes than you could shake a stick at, because I'd never get, well, he would just take them over from me. But yeah, I couldn't get more than 3 puffs. Look at what was in that one night cough syrup, because in fact, you would only cough for one night if you were taking this, and no wonder. I mean, it had alcohol, cannabis, chloroform, and morphine in it. I mean, boy, if you weren't unconscious by the end of the evening, I don't know why you weren't. But in actual fact, I did think about taking some for tonight, because sometimes my voice gives out. But in fact, I thought, no, maybe I won't.
How long ago was that?
Well, up to and just past the turn of the century. So we're talking into the teens, 19 teens. Yep. Yep. I love the Welton's vegetable purifying pills, because in fact, if you took enough of those other patent medicines, you could then take this and cleanse your stomach and purify your blood. That would be perfect, right? And there were testimonials in newspapers. Some newspapers had whole pages of testimonials from satisfied customers who had taken whatever was being sold at the time. And who could resist that? I mean, if you thought you were immune to taking a patent medicine and then you saw her, I mean, Lydia Pinkham, I've got a Lydia Pinkham bottle in my bathroom up on top of my cupboard, because I just love the name Lydia Pinkham. And again, she had pink pills too. and was known across North America for her restorative tonics. So you could take a tonic from Lydia. Mrs. Winslow was out to solve your teething problems with Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. And you can see she's a very busy mom. She's got 3 children up there, or 2 in bed with her here. And she's giving them morphine and ammonia, and that funiculi is fennel. So she's giving them some things that are definitely going to take them off her hands fairly quickly. And it was mentioned that in fact it would cure consumption. It would cure TB, because if you took it every 2 or 3 hours, you'd probably be dead in no time at all. I'm just guessing, I don't know, little person. A lot of medicines were developed, bottled locally by your own either physician or pharmacist, or both in some cases. Dr. McClay, for example, who had the drugstore at the corner of Bay Street and Muskoka Road, was not only a doctor, but he was also a pharmacist. And so he bottled his own McClay's cough balsam. And Dr. Cornell, Dr. Airtown, said, you know, everybody needs to take a little tonic every now and then. And the best tonic is available at the corner drugstore, which was, of course, Dr. Cornell's drugstore. So in fact, he was bottling his own. Now, if all of these patent medicines sound to you like snake oil being marketed, the term actually came from snake oil being marketed. There really was snake oil. So my parents used to refer to what they would have called a salesman who was a bit iffy as a snake oil salesman. Well, in actual fact, there he is. Clark Stanley was selling snake oil. And you could buy it if you wanted. The combination of disease, unsanitary conditions in homes, food adulteration, patent medicine schemes, and so on, all of these things had to be counteracted. And so you had governments attempting to do it. You had public health acts, you had adulteration of food acts, you had statistics being generated about once you had deaths being registered, you had statistics that could show what was killing people. You had special committees report to the Ontario government or the federal government about, you know, sanitation programs and so on. You had all of these things trying to address these issues that were confronting people and doctors. By 1900, what would we actually say about public health in Ontario? Well, in 1866, we had an extremely high death rate. 26.2 per thousand is high. By 1897, however, Toronto had moved into the really good rankings, 5th lowest in North America among cities. And that was basically 15.1 among 1,000 people. The citizens of Toronto did vote to put in a new sewage disposal plant and water filtration plant that would actually be publicly owned and not privately owned, so that it could be controlled, so that you could get rid of all the wooden pipes, which of course were just filled with disease, and in fact put in metal pipes. And you could control where the intake and the output was going to go and whatnot. And that whole system was completed in Toronto in 1913. In 2003, which isn't too long ago, we actually placed 2nd in the world among 122 countries as having the purest or best water quality. Couldn't find our ranking for right now, but yeah, we were better than the USA, better than Great Britain. And look where Belgium was. I don't know what was happening in their country, but they were not doing well. Almost the very lowest. So in Gravenhurst by 1900, public health was improving day by day, and death statistics show that 15 children, that would be 0 to 10, died in the year 1900 from 11 different causes. So in other words, we didn't have whole masses of children dying with diphtheria or with with any of the other diseases that were around. There were actually 11 causes, and many of those were things like drowning and pneumonia and so on. There were 10 more in the townships, the 3 townships that are now part of Ravenhurst around us, with 8 more different causes than the 10 that are up there. So in actual fact, you know, there were a lot of different reasons why children died. Now, sometimes doctors were really at a loss to know what to say on a cause of death. And so they made up some really interesting things. I don't know where they got teething, but anyway, they seemed to suggest it was a possibility. Ravenhurst was trying to enact some bylaws that would at least put the lid on some of the public health issues. So instead of having cattle walking down the main street or down Phillip Street where I live or whatever, you in fact couldn't let your cattle run at large. I have to tell you that that particular warning went into the newspaper any number of years in a row because those cattle were not reading the paper. They obviously weren't. And so they continued to run up and down the streets in town. I don't know. And how the running at large of cattle and the riding of bicycles on sidewalks got to be in the same kind of important warning, I'm not sure. But anyway, you definitely had to renew your dog license. Wells and privies, privy vaults and cesspools, doesn't that sound wonderful? Water closets, we know what that is. Sinks and stables all had to be cleaned out at least once a year by the owner or the occupant of the property. Once a year. Wouldn't that be just a swell job to do? And I know that there were many people who had to hire somebody to do it because they had the money that they could do that. Other people had to do their own. I don't know how thorough the inspections were, but this was in the town of Ravenhurst. This was our Board of Health saying these have to be cleaned. There were rules about infected people being in your home, in your boarding house or your lodging house. And if you had somebody that you suddenly realized was an infected person and you didn't report them, you could be facing penalties of between 25 and $100, which in those days was a huge amount of money. Well, yeah, that one is somewhere, it's Butterworth. So we're talking about just around the turn of the century. I think this one's Butterworth too. Yeah, turn of the century. We're talking about Butterworth, who was the secretary of the town or the clerk of the town. So in fact, we kind of know when he was around. Oh, he's there again, working on communicable diseases in homes and lodging houses. This came out of as well out of Charles Mickle's bill that he put before the community, basically about what to do with people with TB who were not being taken into a sanatorium because the san couldn't take anymore. Now, eventually we had, for people who aren't local, we eventually had 4 tuberculosis sanatoriums in Ravenhurst. We had the first one in Canada. We had the first free one in the world. We had a small one that was a san for a little while until the owner, who was a doctor, could build his dream san, which he eventually opened and then closed the small one. So there were 3 working sans by the 1920s. And we were a place considered to be extremely healthy. The incidence of tuberculosis did not go up with all those sanatoriums. In fact, we had a very low incidence of tuberculosis in Ravenhurst. And in fact, we continued to have those sans running up until 1935, when it was pretty much starting to be a thing of the past. This is a 1960 notice, and I see it's Mr. DeLong was a sanitary inspector. Don't know how much he did, but cleaning out of all yards, outbuildings, and privies again, pigsties, ash pits, cesspools, and other wonderful things. Well, isn't that a good question, Mary? Yeah, well, this is exactly the thing. That was the question. What did you do with it? Okay, you clean it all out, you get it all out of there, and then you, where do you put it? Put it on a field for the vegetables to grow in. Take it out on the ice just before the ice is going to melt, so it'll go into the lake. Bury it. I mean, there were no good answers to that question. There were no good answers at all. We're lucky that we don't have to deal with human waste now. But in those days, where was it going to go if you were cleaning it out? I've always loved Lennon's line, every day in every way, we're getting better and better. I did end it with a question mark because in actual fact, that's true in so many ways. Our life expectancy rose in 1925 from 61 to 2025. We have now a life expectancy of 83.2 years in Canada. Indigenous people, on the other hand, went from between 30 and 40, depending upon the circumstances in which they lived. So 30 to 40 in 1925 to 62.8, which came down 7 years from 2015. So in actual fact, they were doing better in 2015 than they were doing by 2023. The Inuit slightly better, 70 for men, 76 for women in 2019, and those were the newest I could get. But for every statistic that's cited about Canadians, no matter what it is, you have to ask yourself, because 9 times out of 10, Indigenous people have not been included in the statistics. I mean, it's just a fact. For one thing, the statistics on Indigenous people are often, and were always, kept by another department, not the Department of Health, but rather the Department of Indian Affairs. So in actual fact, they didn't make it into the calculations, those numbers, because those numbers were being held somewhere else, and they were considered to be other.
Well, when was the Department of Indian Affairs
formed? Well, in Canada and in our part of the world, it became a factor of living in 1880. So in actual fact, we see reports to the Department of Indian Affairs by the Indian agent, who was, of course, not an Indigenous person, but a white person. And he would be reporting on conditions in an Indigenous community to the government. And he would always make it sound pretty darn rosy. Things were pretty good. In fact, you really wondered what he was seeing and whether he'd even been anywhere near an Indigenous person. Just for your peace of mind, there is a list of 2025 approved adulterating substances in foods. Who thought that our food could still be adulterated? Well, it can. However, if you start to read part 2, you realize it is truly a government document, because as you start to read it, you are going in column 2 of part 2 with column 1 in column 3 of part 2, column 2 of part 2, column 2 of part 2, and by the time you're done, your head is just spinning and you have no idea what you've just read. So that's called obfuscation, and it's obfuscation by intent, because we don't really want to tell anybody the truth. But to allay any fears you might have about food additives and adulterated foods, there are safe levels spelled out for how much arsenic you can have in 2025, how much cyanide and how much lead in any of your food. Just go to canada.ca/ and there you go. And you can see just how much of that you can consume healthfully.
Does that have to be on food labels?
No, I don't think so. No, if you were to pick up a product in the grocery store and you would look at it and it says, and contains arsenic, cyanide, and lead, you'd put it back on the shelf. So in fact, no, because it's, very small amounts, very trace amounts. Mary, what are you worried about? Good heavens.
Wow.
Anyway, questions?
Had any masking protocols back in the day, or would they have?
They had more than you might think. You'll recall that in 1919, there was a huge influenza pandemic spread across the world. And my son wrote a book about that pandemic in Canada. And he has photographs in it of people wearing masks. Now, they were the healthcare providers who were doing it, not necessarily the people on the street. And of course, children wearing masks. In those days, it certainly didn't happen. No. Yes, it was Spanish influenza. Exactly. So,
I think I've read that, Mark would know this for sure, that whereas we put the masks on indoors, they were wearing them outdoors because they thought,
why not? Because so many people believed for that whole period of Victorian and Edwardian Canada that bad air was what was infecting you, right? So in actual fact, you can imagine people wearing a mask to keep the bad air out, not to keep the germs in and not spread them, because so many people believe that there was some kind of miasma in the air that would somehow infect you.
did you know Obi Johnson?
Yes.
Well, I wish I could remember the details of the story, but his family is from Seguin Township.
Mhm.
And there's a family in Margaret to this day somewhere there. But something like he was from a family of, don't quote me, but 12, 13 children, like
Mhm.
a big family.
Mhm.
And they lost like 11 members of the family in a number of days.
Yeah.
What disease would that have been?
Probably tuberculosis, although it could have been it could have been cholera or smallpox as well, depending upon the year.
The sudden fever thing.
Maybe scarlet fever then, yes, or typhoid fever for that matter, because that was contaminated water. So depending upon, your circumstances at the time, whether you were traveling, whether you were taking people into your home, whether you had somehow access to pure water, it could be anything really.
Obi survived, but
Gosh.
the civil did
No, isn't that amazing?
be in its 90s.
Yes, exactly. So what didn't kill you only made you stronger. There you go. Yeah. And certainly in my mother's family with tuberculosis, I know I've told people this many times, but in my mother's family with tuberculosis, she lost everyone in her family except one sister. So she lost 4 sisters and her mother, all in the space of about a year and a half. And they just fell like flies in the family. And she talked to me about waking a child, they called it, the wake, right, in the house. So the child who was contaminated with tuberculosis is lying in an open coffin in the living room, and all the neighbors are coming through. The things that went on, people not realizing how things happened and how things spread and so on. But we just didn't have the education for it to know.
Or the science.
Or exactly the science that many of the causes and the ways of dealing with this have just not been investigated. We didn't have statistics. We didn't have, all kinds of things. So it was a difficult time for an awful lot of people. And as I mentioned, classrooms, I mean, my goodness, every classroom is just a little hotbed of, of germs, And I mean, sometimes it's just the cold and you kind of go, okay. But if you've got a smallpox epidemic going on in your area, that's a hotbed of something completely different.
I remember during the war, we used to line up and there'd be one spoon and orange juice and cod liver oil.
Yep.
And we'd have 50 people
All with
using
the
that
same spoon. Yep. So you got your cod liver and you got your orange juice, but you got your germs as well. Yeah, yeah.
What about the incidence? Oh, sorry. What about the incidence of polio?
Yeah, there were epidemics of polio starting early in the 1900s. The first one went through about 1903 or 4. My mother caught it in 1909 and had to learn to walk all over again, but luckily survived it. Her littlest sister did not survive it. So that was the first one, but the really big one that most of us will remember, not you, but the 1950s, the huge fear of polio and just the whole concentration on being vaccinated, hearing about iron lungs, knowing about kids who died from it. There was a boy here, Albert Federley, who died of polio. Yeah. in the 50s.
Sometime, like in the 30s or something, I remember my dad and sister lived in Toronto,
Mhm.
but my grandmother kept them up at the cottage in Halliburton in that fall. Well, dad was too young to go to school, but the other kids had the
Polio,
in
yep,
Toronto.
yep. It came through in sort of 20-year waves. So there'd be a wave and then 20 years, a wave and 20 years. And that happens with a number of other diseases, but polio particularly, that was one. And it, you know, I mean, people were terrified of polio, absolutely terrified, you know, and they started building iron lungs by hand at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto. They only had one iron lung. And the first kid came in with polio, iron lung. Now we've got another kid with polio. Now what are we going to do? They're literally in the basement of Sick Kids Hospital, creating by hand iron lungs out of wood and things. Yeah.
I was sitting here trying to remember, what do we, the vaccination for polio? I received the Salk vaccine
In a little paper cup. That's right.
lined up with
The Salk vaccine. That's right. Yep.
that was all.
I think, I don't remember another one. I mean, we all probably got the one with for smallpox, and we all had that odd looking little mess on our arm because they were actually injecting smallpox. Yeah, so yeah, we've all gone through, well, not all of us. You got away with yeah. But we, you know, we were in school, so we would be lining up for these things. You know, you lined up to get vaccinated, and then if it didn't take, in other words, if you didn't have this nasty looking thing on your arm, you had to go back and get it all over again, which I did twice because, of course, with TB, my mother had been exposed to TB with all her family dying, so she was a carrier. That was a carrier to me. Therefore, the TB vaccine didn't take on me until the third vaccination. So every time I was back up there again at the front of the room getting vaccinated. I'm not sure about that. Maybe so, or just so much exposure to it, which is what caused your natural immunity, which would have been the case of my mother. Yeah. Yeah. So most of us went through that kind of stuff. And the little paper cup, I remember very well with the Salk vaccine in it. Yeah. 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 Anybody else question before we part for the evening? There's coffee and cookies on your way out there, and you're welcome to help yourself. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you.